The dead weight of a human body falls differently in the underhive than it does above. The artificial gravity generators, 3 levels down from the primary residential blocks, pulse at irregular intervals, a maintenance schedule abandoned during the Grox Wars, but never restored. When the generators stutter, a sleeping form becomes momentarily weightless before crashing back to the corrugated metal flooring with enough force to wake entire hab blocks. That is, assuming anyone in those blocks is still capable of waking up. Administratum Survey Team Tertius 9 documented the mathematics with clinical precision during the 947 M41 census sweep of Hive Tertius. The numbers carved themselves into official record with the quiet brutality of bureaucratic fact. 2.3 hours, the average duration of uninterrupted sleep among lower-level residents. Not rest, sleep. The distinction matters here, where rest might mean propping oneself against a vibrating coolant pipe while maintaining enough awareness to distinguish between the footsteps of sanitation serfs and the softer tread of night stalkers prowling for fresh meat. The surveyors carried portable chronometers to measure sleep cycles, motion detectors to verify unconsciousness, and body counters to track what the official reports termed rest-related cessation events. 67%. That figure appears on line 394 of sub-document Tertius 9 Delta, filed under Municipal Health Statistics and marked for standard archival burial. 67% of underhive residents who attempt full sleep periods, defined as 4 hours of verified unconsciousness, experience cessation events within 1 standard week. The mathematics become more precise when broken down by residential tier. Block Gamma, housing 14,000 munitions workers and their dependents, records average sleep durations of 1.7 hours. Their cessation rate climbs to 71%. Block Beta 7, reserved for mid-tier manufactorum supervisors, manages 3.1 hours of sleep and sees only 42% cessation. The pattern holds across 17 surveyed residential zones. The longer you sleep, the more likely you are to die doing it. But the most revealing statistic appears in sub-document Tertius 9 Gamma, sealed under Administratum Classification, Protocol 7. The surveyors discovered that residents who regularly achieve 6 hours of continuous sleep show cessation rates approaching 94% within 72 hours. Not weeks, hours. Something in the underhive ecosystem has evolved to hunt the well-rested with surgical precision. The workers know this. They call it micro-sleep, the art of snatching moments of unconsciousness while maintaining just enough awareness to distinguish real threats from the fever dreams that plague the chronically exhausted. A 5-minute doze against a warm air recycler. 30 seconds of darkness while the foreman's attention turns elsewhere. Brief surrenders, too. Unconsciousness that never quite achieve the deep rest that human biology demands. Watch a underhive worker's sleep pattern through a week-long surveillance recording, and the rhythm becomes apparent. Every 3.7 hours, micro-sleep episodes cluster together, 14 to 16 instances of 12 to 23 seconds each. The human nervous system fragments rest into pieces small enough to slip past the predators that patrol the border between waking and sleeping. It works after a fashion. Micro-sleepers show cessation rates of only 19% compared to the baseline population. The cost, naturally, compounds. Habitation Medicus Viridian Kolth documented the caloric burden in her classified study of workforce efficiency degradation. A human body attempting to rest in the standard underhive environment burns an additional 340 calories per sleep cycle compared to baseline imperial standards. The constant micro-alertness required to detect approaching threats, the elevated stress hormones needed to wake from each micro-sleep episode, the muscular tension maintained even during unconsciousness, all of this demands fuel. Food the workers do not have. Nutrition that exists only in the theoretical ration allocations printed on distribution cards, but rarely manifests in the thin protein paste dispensed at feeding stations. Kolth's study revealed the trap with mathematical clarity. Workers require more calories to sleep safely, but chronic exhaustion reduces work efficiency, which reduces ration allocations, which makes adequate rest even more physiologically expensive. The equation balances only through systematic starvation of sleep itself. Yet the most disturbing pattern in survey team Tertius IX's data appears not in the death statistics, but in the precision of the record-keeping itself. The administratum maintains real-time sleep-death correlations for 17 million underhive residents across 43 hab zones. Motion sensors, thermal monitors, and acoustic pickups track sleep patterns with industrial thoroughness. The data streams flow to cogitator banks buried deep in the hive's administrative core, where algorithmic systems calculate optimal work shifts, ration distributions, and security patrol routes based on population rest cycles. Why such meticulous surveillance of something the Imperial Creed officially dismisses as spiritual weakness? Why monitor the sleep of citizens the authorities claim to value only for their productive output? The answer lies encoded in Classification Protocol 7 documents that chart not just individual sleep patterns, but their correlation with lunar cycles, warp storm activity, and what the files euphemistically term behavioral anomaly incidents. The administratum's interest in sleep goes beyond productivity metrics. They track it because something else tracks it first, something that hunts through the vulnerable territory between consciousness and dreams, using rest itself as a hunting ground. The mathematics of rest in the underhive operate according to a simple equation. The deeper you sleep, the less likely you are to wake up. But the corollary proves more disturbing. The institutions that govern this nightmare pay very careful attention to who sleeps when and how deeply they surrender to unconsciousness. That attention suggests knowledge, and knowledge implies purpose behind the systematic brutalization of something as basic as human rest. The surveyor's reports document the symptoms, but the underlying pathology reaches beyond simple urban decay or criminal predation. Something about sleep in the underhive requires institutional management at the highest levels of imperial bureaucracy. Something significant enough to justify the resources spent monitoring millions of exhausted workers as they steal moments of unconsciousness in the margins of their brutalized lives. The workers sense this, even if they cannot articulate it. They develop sleep rituals that go beyond mere security precautions. Small wards scratched into metal walls, whispered prayers to the Emperor's vigilance, careful positioning of bodies to face doorways or air vents. The gestures of people who understand, at some instinctive level, that their rest is being observed and catalogued by forces that consider their unconsciousness a matter of significant strategic interest. In the underhive, sleep becomes a form of naked vulnerability, that attracts predators operating according to rules more complex than simple hunger or criminal opportunity. The mathematics suggest coordination, planning, and resources dedicated to exploiting human rest with systematic efficiency. But the true horror lies in what those numbers imply about the infrastructure built around that exploitation, and what manner of threat could justify such comprehensive surveillance of something as intimate as sleep itself. The infrastructure itself conspires against rest with mechanical precision. Every component of under-Hive architecture operates according to design principles that treat human sleep as a systemic vulnerability requiring constant disruption. The conspiracy begins with the walls themselves, pressed metal sheeting calculated to amplify rather than muffle sound transmission. Standard Imperial construction specifications call for wall thickness of 2.3 centimeters in residential blocks. Enough to provide structural integrity. Not enough to prevent the footsteps of a neighbor 3 hab units away from echoing through sleeping quarters with crystal clarity. The acoustic properties follow deliberate engineering logic. Ferrocrete would dampen sound transmission by 73% while adding only marginal cost to construction budgets. Pressed metal amplifies it by 41% while requiring identical resource allocation. The choice becomes obvious when viewed through the lens of systems designed to prevent deep sleep rather than facilitate it. But the true architectural malice reveals itself in the ventilation networks that thread through every residential block like mechanical arteries. The air recycling systems operate on 3-shift cycles: filtration, pressurization, and what the technical manuals term atmospheric maintenance phases. During filtration cycles, airflow increases to maximum capacity, generating the white noise that might ordinarily mask other sounds and permit rest. During pressurization, the system maintains steady atmospheric composition with minimal acoustic signature. The atmospheric maintenance phase occurs precisely during the statistical peak sleep hours, identified by administratum surveillance. Air circulation drops to minimum sustainable levels. Toxin scrubbers reduce efficiency by 60%. Temperature regulation fails systematically, allowing the accumulated heat of human bodies and industrial processes to build in closed spaces until the air itself becomes thick enough to wake the unconscious. Habitation engineer Mordecai Krell documented the pattern in his sealed report to the sector administratum. Atmospheric maintenance phases consistently coincide with population rest periods, creating environmental conditions that make sustained unconsciousness physiologically impossible. The timing proves too precise for coincidence, too consistent for mechanical failure. The temperature fluctuations alone operate like clockwork torture. As sleep cycles deepen, the atmospheric maintenance systems allow ambient temperatures to rise 13 degrees above comfort standards. Human bodies struggling to maintain rest begin sweating through dehydrated systems, creating the paradox of exhaustion that prevents sleep, which prevents the recovery needed to achieve rest. When residents finally stir to semi-consciousness, the systems restore normal atmospheric conditions within minutes, just long enough for bodies to begin relaxing before the next scheduled maintenance phase begins. Sleep position becomes a matter of survival calculus. The corrugated flooring channels vibrations from industrial machinery 3 levels below, but the patterns vary by location within each residential unit, Positions near exterior walls receive maximum sound amplification from pressed metal construction. Positions near interior walls suffer maximum temperature fluctuation from failing atmospheric systems. The geometric center of each HAB unit offers the only marginally survivable sleep location. But space constraints mean most residential units house 4 to 6 workers in areas designed for single occupancy. The mathematics of positioning become lethal when population density increases beyond design specifications. Workers learn to sleep in shifts not by choice, but because only 1 or 2 bodies can occupy the minimal safe space simultaneously. The others remain alert, watching for threats that range from structural collapse to human predation, while their shiftmates steal what rest they can before rotating positions. Yet even the safest positions offer no protection from the architectural feature that kills more sleepers than any other single factor. The structural instability that manifests during what maintenance logs euphemistically term low activity periods. Building failures occur with statistical clustering during night cycles at rates that defy explanation through normal wear patterns or load distribution. Support beam failures, ceiling collapses, ventilation duct ruptures that flood sleeping areas with superheated industrial gases. Habituation structural engineer Vash Koren's classified analysis identified the pattern that official reports ignore. Critical structural failures occur during rest periods at a rate 340% higher than random distribution would predict. The buildings themselves appear programmed to fail when their occupants are least capable of escape. The programming follows maintenance schedules buried in technical specifications few workers ever see. Load-bearing supports receive inspection and reinforcement during day shifts when residents are absent at work assignments. Critical system maintenance occurs during active periods, when problems can be immediately addressed. But the deeper structural systems, the foundational supports, primary power couplings, and atmospheric emergency backups, these receive maintenance only during designated minimal occupancy windows. Minimal occupancy windows that coincide precisely with sleep cycles. The result, infrastructure most likely to cause catastrophic failure, receives attention only when the maximum number of residents are unconscious and unable to respond to emergency situations. The engineering logic appears inverted, unless viewed through the perspective of systems designed to exploit rather than protect sleeping populations. Workers develop sleep adaptations that reflect their unconscious understanding of architectural hostility. They position themselves near escape routes rather than comfortable locations. They maintain partial awareness of structural vibrations that might signal impending collapse. They learn to distinguish between the acoustic signatures of normal building stress and the specific frequency patterns that precede catastrophic failure. The most experienced under-hive sleepers can detect minute changes in air pressure that indicate ventilation system failures, temperature shifts that suggest atmospheric maintenance phases, and the subtle harmonic variations in wall vibrations that precede support beam failures. Their sleep becomes a form of environmental monitoring, rest achieved while maintaining enough sensory awareness to survive the building's attempts to kill them. But this vigilant semi-sleep extracts its own price. The human nervous system, evolved for cycles of deep unconsciousness and full alertness, begins fragmenting under the demand for continuous partial awareness. Sleep debt accumulates not just from insufficient rest, but from the inability to achieve the deep unconsciousness necessary for neural repair and memory consolidation. The architecture creates populations trapped between two forms of death: the immediate physical threats that destroy those who sleep too deeply, and the gradual psychological dissolution that consumes those who maintain perpetual vigilance. The buildings themselves become instruments of systematic torture, designed with mechanical precision to prevent the rest human biology requires, while creating the environmental stresses that make rest increasingly desperately needed. Yet the most disturbing aspect of Hive architecture lies not in its hostility to sleep, but in the sophisticated coordination required to maintain such systematic environmental warfare. The timing of maintenance phases, the precision of temperature fluctuations, the acoustic properties of wall construction, all of these require central planning and resource allocation that suggests institutional commitment to sleep prevention at the highest levels of Imperial engineering. The buildings attack their occupants according to schedules that coordinate with surveillance systems, monitoring individual sleep patterns. The architecture itself has become weaponized, but weapons require operators who understand their targets well enough to maximize damage while maintaining plausible deniability. In the Underhive, even the walls have learned to hunt. The walls may hunt, but they lack the predatory intelligence to exploit the vulnerability they create. That intelligence manifests in the human ecosystems that have evolved to thrive in the architectural nightmare. Predators who understand that unconscious prey offers opportunities unavailable during waking hours. They move through the same ventilation systems that torment sleepers, navigate by the same acoustic amplification that prevents rest, and strike during the precise windows when atmospheric maintenance phases leave victims too disoriented to resist effectively. The organ thieves work with surgical precision, their trade dependent on harvesting from living subjects whose pain responses remain suppressed by exhaustion. Medicae records from Hive Tertius document a pattern that correlates directly with sleep cycle data. Kidney extractions increase by 67% during documented rest periods, liver harvesting peaks during atmospheric maintenance phases, and the specialized removal of neural tissue, the most lucrative organ trade, occurs almost exclusively during the deepest micro-sleep episodes workers manage to achieve. Thief surgeon Malik Vaughan, captured during an Arbeits sweep of Block Gamma 7, provided testimony under interrogation that revealed the technical sophistication behind sleep hunting operations. The organ thieves carry portable atmospheric monitors calibrated to detect the specific chemical signatures of deep sleep: elevated carbon dioxide levels, reduced oxygen consumption, and the pheromone traces that indicate genuine unconsciousness rather than feigned rest. They know, with scientific precision, when a target has achieved the depth of sleep necessary for surgical intervention without anesthetic. Their tools reflect this specialization. Neural probes that can extract brain tissue without waking the subject. Vascular clamps that prevent blood loss during organ removal while maintaining enough circulation to preserve tissue viability. Synthetic stimulants designed not to enhance performance, but to maintain victims in a state of semi-consciousness that prevents both deep sleep and fully alert resistance. The thieves have industrialized the harvest of human bodies too exhausted to defend themselves. But organ theft represents only the most economically motivated form of sleep predation. The recruitment gangs operate according to different logic, hunting not for immediate profit, but for the raw material of human desperation that exhaustion provides. Gang recruiter Vex Corridon, interviewed before his execution for sedition against Imperial workforce stability, described sleep hunting as fundamental to maintaining gang population levels. Exhausted workers make ideal gang recruits precisely because chronic sleep deprivation destroys the judgment necessary to evaluate long-term consequences. The gangs offer what the Imperial system denies: protection during rest periods, guaranteed food rations, and most seductively, scheduled sleep in secure locations. The recruitment pitch requires no coercion when delivered to populations driven to desperation by months of micro-sleep survival. The gangs maintain sleep houses, fortified locations where new recruits can experience their first deep rest in years. The initial recruitment depends entirely on this offer of unconsciousness, delivered to people whose resistance has been systematically eroded by architectural torture and institutional neglect. Once recruitment is complete, the sleep becomes conditional on loyalty, performance, and participation in the same predatory activities that target other exhausted populations. Vex Corridon's testimony revealed the tactical sophistication gang operations have developed around sleep cycles. Recruitment raids target specific HAB blocks during documented rest periods, using portable atmospheric sensors identical to those employed by organ thieves. The gangs know which residents are attempting sleep, where they position themselves for minimal safety, and when they achieve the exhaustion levels that make recruitment offers irresistible. Their infiltration techniques exploit the same architectural vulnerabilities that torment legitimate residents. Gang members navigate through ventilation systems during atmospheric maintenance phases, when reduced air circulation prevents detection by scent, and when background noise masks movement. They use the temperature fluctuations to time their approaches, striking when heat buildup has left targets semi-conscious and disoriented. But the most disturbing aspect of gang sleep hunting lies in their apparent coordination with official scheduling systems. Recruitment raids occur with suspicious frequency during planned infrastructure maintenance, when Arbeits patrols follow documented patterns that leave specific HAB blocks temporarily unmonitored. The timing suggests access to Imperial administrative data that should remain classified well beyond gang-level intelligence capabilities. The recreational hunters represent the most psychologically complex category of sleep predator, motivated not by profit or recruitment, but by the unique psychological satisfaction that comes from victimizing the completely helpless. Their activities follow patterns documented in sealed Arbeits files under Classification Protocol 9. Systematic torture of sleeping victims who cannot wake quickly enough to understand what is happening to them. Hunter-killer Jace Mordian, terminated during an Arbeits counter-predation sweep, kept detailed logs of his activities that reveal the psychological appeal of sleep hunting. The unconscious represent perfect victims, unable to resist, unable to flee, and often unable to form clear memories of attacks that occurred during deep sleep phases. The hunters develop elaborate scenarios of prolonged torment, specifically designed to exploit the disorientation and helplessness that characterize the transition between sleep and waking. Their techniques show disturbing creativity, precisely calibrated pain that brings victims to semi-consciousness without achieving full alertness, psychological torture that exploits the confusion between dreams and reality, that plagues the chronically exhausted, and systematic brutalization that leaves victims uncertain whether attacks actually occurred or represent hallucinations born from sleep deprivation. The recreational hunters maintain detailed knowledge of their prey's sleep schedules, often stalking individual targets for weeks to understand their rest patterns, preferred sleeping locations, and the specific environmental conditions that allow each victim to achieve unconsciousness. Their logs document intimate knowledge of which workers attempt sleep during which maintenance phases, who has adapted to which architectural vulnerabilities, and when each target reaches the specific exhaustion levels that permit successful hunting. Yet the most revealing pattern in predator behavior emerges from the temporal coordination between different hunting categories. Organ theft, gang recruitment, and recreational hunting occur in sophisticated sequences that suggest communication and resource sharing between predator groups. Areas harvested by organ thieves become recruitment territory for gangs seeking traumatized workers. Gang territories become hunting grounds for recreational predators targeting recruits who fail loyalty tests. The predator ecosystem operates like an industrial process. Organ thieves harvest the immediately profitable. Gangs process the traumatized remainder into criminal labor. And recreational hunters dispose of the psychologically damaged waste products. Each category creates opportunities for the others while maintaining the overall population of exhausted, vulnerable prey, necessary to sustain the entire predatory economy. Most disturbing, the coordination extends to intelligence sharing that suggests access to official surveillance data. Predator groups demonstrate knowledge of individual sleep patterns that could only come from the same monitoring systems the administratum uses to track rest cycles across residential populations. The hunters know not just when workers sleep, but how deeply, for how long, and in which specific locations within their HAB units. This level of intelligence coordination points to institutional connections that go beyond simple corruption or negligence. The predator ecosystem appears integrated with official surveillance infrastructure, suggesting that sleep hunting serves purposes that extend beyond individual criminal enterprise into systematic population management through targeted predation. In the underhive, the unconscious become prey to hunters whose sophistication and coordination implies resources and intelligence networks that operate with quasi-official sanction. The exhausted workers who steal moments of rest face predators who hunt with industrial efficiency and institutional knowledge, suggesting that sleep itself has become a form of bait in a larger trap, whose true operators remain carefully hidden behind layers of criminal activity and bureaucratic plausible deniability. The predators create the market creates the economy, and the economy transforms basic human vulnerability into a commodity traded with the same bureaucratic precision that governs ammunition distribution or protein ration allocation. Where sleep becomes a form of hunting ground, protection services emerge to exploit both predator and prey through carefully calibrated offerings of security that cost exactly what desperate workers can afford to pay. The economics follow brutal mathematical logic. A standard under-Hive laborer earns 17 Imperial credits per standard work cycle. Food rations consume 11 credits at authorized distribution centers. Transportation to work assignments requires 2 credits for maglev access fees. Housing taxes extract 3 credits for Hab unit occupation permits. That leaves 1 credit of discretionary income per cycle, precisely the amount charged by entry-level protection services for what their promotional materials term basic rest security. The most common protection offering involves shift guards, unemployed workers who maintain vigilance while others attempt sleep in exchange for a rotation system that provides each participant with marginally safer rest periods. A typical shift guard arrangement involves 4 workers pooling resources to hire a 5th worker who provides 6 hours of watch duty per cycle. The economics appear reasonable until the true mathematics emerge. 5 workers sharing the cost means each pays the same amount they would individually, but receives only 1.2 hours of protected sleep instead of the 6 hours they could attempt unguarded. The protection reduces available rest time while increasing costs, but still attracts desperate customers because 1.2 hours of guaranteed unconsciousness proves more valuable than 6 hours of vulnerability to predation. The shift guards themselves demonstrate this calculation by working protection services during their assigned rest periods rather than attempting their own sleep. Earning credits has become more survivable than spending time unconscious. The mid-tier protection services operate from fortified locations that rent secure sleep space by the hour. Safe sleep rentals advertise soundproofed chambers, filtered air systems, and armed guards monitoring access points during designated rest periods. The facilities charge 7 credits per hour of protected sleep, half a worker's daily wages for 60 minutes of unconsciousness. But the true cost calculation includes the transportation time, waiting periods, and documentation requirements that transform a simple hour of sleep into a 4-hour commitment requiring advanced scheduling, identity verification, and compliance with facility regulations that mirror Imperial military protocols. Workers who can afford safe sleep rentals find themselves spending their rest periods navigating bureaucratic procedures designed to verify their right to unconsciousness. The mathematics become increasingly perverse at higher protection levels. Premium security services promise guaranteed dream integrity and supernatural protection protocols for fees that exceed standard worker wages by several orders of magnitude. These services cater to mid-level supervisors and administrative personnel whose income levels theoretically provide access to better rest security, but whose elevated position in the Imperial hierarchy makes them targets for more sophisticated predation. Premium protection involves comprehensive surveillance monitoring, armed response teams, and what service contracts euphemistically term threat elimination with full legal indemnification. The clients pay not just for guards, but for the bureaucratic infrastructure necessary to ensure that violence committed in their defense receives official sanction rather than Arbeit's investigation. The most expensive protection services operate with resources that suggest connections extending well beyond commercial security operations. Eternal Vigilance Security Consortium maintains facilities equipped with military-grade detection equipment, employs personnel with specialized training in anti-psychic warfare, and offers protection guarantees that seem to defy the statistical realities of underhive predation. Their promotional materials make claims that border on the supernatural. 100% elimination of dream-based infiltration. Guaranteed protection against warp-influenced sleep predation. Anti-institutional-grade counter-surveillance during all rest periods. The services come with price tags that approach the annual wages of entire underhive work crews, but maintain waiting lists of clients willing to pay for protection that promises security against threats most Imperial citizens do not officially acknowledge exist. The pricing structure reveals the most disturbing aspect of the protection economy. Services are calibrated to consume precisely the amount of disposable income available to each economic tier, leaving clients with just enough resources to survive, but never enough to escape their dependence on purchased security. Entry-level workers pay their single discretionary credit. Mid-level supervisors pay their modest surplus income. Premium clients surrender their accumulated savings to maintain protection that becomes psychologically addictive as it becomes financially ruinous. The protection economy operates as a perfect trap. Predation creates demand for security. Security costs consume the income that might otherwise provide escape from predator-infested areas, and the ongoing expense of protection maintains populations in exactly the economic conditions that make them optimal targets for continued predation. But the most sophisticated aspect of the protection economy lies in its integration with the same predator networks it claims to combat. Detailed analysis of Arbite's incident reports reveals statistical patterns that suggest coordination between protection services and criminal organizations. Areas with high protection service presence show reduced random predation but increased targeted attacks on non-customers, creating market pressure that drives additional sales while maintaining optimal predator population levels. The protection services appear to operate as intermediaries in a managed ecosystem where predation occurs at controlled rates designed to generate maximum revenue from security sales without depleting the customer base through excessive casualties. They function as both protector and predator, providing genuine security to paying customers while ensuring that enough threat remains to justify continued purchases. This managed predation requires intelligence coordination that extends beyond simple commercial partnerships. Protection services demonstrate knowledge of official patrol schedules, maintenance windows, and administrative policies that affect sleep security across entire HAB blocks. Their timing and resource allocation suggests access to the same surveillance data that coordinates predator hunting patterns and architectural system failures. The protection economy has evolved into a quasi-official industry that regulates rather than eliminates sleep predation, maintaining optimal threat levels while extracting maximum revenue from populations too desperate to refuse purchased security and too impoverished to afford genuine safety. The services sell managed vulnerability rather than actual protection, creating sustainable business models based on carefully calibrated desperation. Most disturbing, the protection industry shows signs of coordination with official enforcement agencies that suggests institutional sanction for commercial exploitation of sleep vulnerability. Protection service contracts include legal provisions that mirror Imperial military protocols, Their personnel carry equipment restricted to authorized security forces, and their operational procedures follow bureaucratic standards that indicate direct connection to administratum oversight systems. The protection economy transforms sleep from a basic human need into a commercial transaction managed by networks that appear to operate with quasi-governmental authority. Workers do not purchase safety. They purchase participation in a regulated system of managed predation, where their continued survival depends on maintaining exact economic relationships with organizations that profit from the same threats they claim to address. In the Underhive, protection itself has become another form of predation, more sophisticated and sustainable than simple violence, creating populations of customers whose economic dependency ensures their continued vulnerability to exactly the threats they pay to avoid. The protection economy creates perfect customers for the institutions that claim to maintain order through official channels. When commercial security services regulate predation rather than eliminate it, populations become dependent on purchasing safety from the same networks that coordinate the threats they face. This dependency creates opportunities for official enforcement agencies who understand that desperate people make compliant citizens, and that sleep-deprived populations offer minimal resistance to systematic brutalization disguised as law enforcement. The Arbeits maintain patrol schedules that coordinate precisely with protection service operations and commercial sleep cycles. Sub-Inspector Vortigern Kess documented this coordination in sealed reports filed under administrative classification Tertius. Enforcement sweeps occur with statistically significant clustering during rest periods when maximum numbers of workers are unconscious and unable to respond to official action. The timing appears designed to maximize arrests while minimizing resistance. But the true sophistication of official sleep predation emerges from the legal framework that criminalizes rest itself. Imperial Law Codex Section 1247-Delta defines unauthorized unconsciousness during designated vigilance periods as a Class C violation of civic duty, punishable by work detail assignment, ration reduction, or HAB unit reassignment to less secure residential areas. The law transforms sleep from a biological necessity into a privilege that must be earned through documented compliance with productivity quotas and behavioral standards. The enforcement protocols reveal institutional logic designed to exploit rather than protect vulnerable populations. Arbeit sweeps target sleeping quarters during the precise windows when exhausted workers finally achieve unconsciousness, using noise suppressors and movement dampers to approach undetected. The arrests occur before targets achieve full alertness, ensuring compliance through disorientation rather than genuine legal process. Arbitrator Maxim Koroth's classified enforcement manual details the tactical procedures. Rest violations require immediate custody transfer during maintained confusion states. Subjects achieving full consciousness demonstrate increased non-compliance with standard detention protocols. Optimal arrest conditions occur during microsleep transitions when resistance responses remain suppressed. The manual reads like a predator hunting guide, complete with technical specifications for timing approaches, identifying vulnerable sleep positions, and exploiting the psychological disorientation that characterizes transitions between unconsciousness and alertness. Official law enforcement has adopted the same techniques used by criminal sleep hunters, applying them with bureaucratic systematization rather than individual opportunism. The processing centers that handle sleep violation arrests operate according to schedules that maintain systematic sleep deprivation as both punishment and investigation technique. Detention facilities maintain constant illumination, acoustic disruption, and temperature fluctuation designed to prevent rest during processing periods that typically extend 72 to 96 hours. The facilities transform exhaustion from a condition requiring assistance into a tool for extracting compliance and confession. Detention processing specialist Meridian Vex documented the interrogation protocols in reports marked for administrative archive burial. Suspects subjected to systematic sleep deprivation for 48 hours demonstrate 89% compliance with confession procedures, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. The technique proves so effective that many suspects confess to violations they did not commit, simply to gain access to the supervised rest periods provided after formal conviction. But the most disturbing aspect of official sleep persecution lies in the bureaucratic infrastructure that treats rest as a resource requiring central management rather than a basic human need requiring protection. The Imperial Administratum maintains detailed sleep allocation databases that track individual rest patterns, assign sleep quotas based on productivity metrics, and coordinate punishment schedules that use exhaustion as systematic torture. Work Detail Coordinator Vassian Thorne's sealed directives reveal the true scope of institutional sleep management. Individual rest allocations shall not exceed productivity-justified requirements. Workers demonstrating output levels below sectoral averages forfeit sleep privileges until performance standards achieve compliance. Unauthorized rest attempts during privilege suspension periods constitute Class B violations requiring immediate correctional intervention. The directives transform sleep into a reward system controlled by imperial bureaucracy, distributed according to productivity metrics rather than biological necessity. Workers who fail to meet output quotas lose the legal right to unconsciousness, creating populations driven to desperate exhaustion while facing criminal penalties for attempting the rest their bodies require to function. The enforcement of sleep privilege suspension requires surveillance infrastructure that monitors rest attempts across entire residential populations. Motion detectors, thermal sensors, and acoustic analysis systems track individual sleep patterns with industrial precision, generating automated alerts when suspended workers attempt unauthorized unconsciousness. The surveillance creates perfect intelligence for enforcement sweeps while providing detailed data on population rest patterns that serves multiple bureaucratic purposes. Most significantly, the sleep surveillance data integrates with the same monitoring systems used by protection services and criminal predator networks. The Administratum's sleep management databases contain the same detailed rest pattern information that enables targeted predation, suggesting institutional coordination between official enforcement and unofficial exploitation of sleep vulnerability. The bureaucratic language reveals the underlying logic. Imperial directives refer to sleep as non-productive time allocation, rest periods as efficiency reduction intervals, and unconsciousness as voluntary productivity suspension requiring administrative oversight. The terminology treats basic biological function as economic inefficiency that requires systematic correction through legal and enforcement mechanisms. But the true horror emerges from the quota systems that measure enforcement success based on sleep violation arrests rather than actual security improvements. Arbeits units receive performance evaluations based on rest violation statistics, creating institutional incentives to maximize sleep-related arrests regardless of their impact on population safety or productivity. The system rewards enforcement activity that increases rather than reduces the desperation driving workers toward protection, service dependency, and predator vulnerability. Enforcement Coordinator Declan Morveck's operational reports document the mathematical precision. Target quotas require minimum 15 sleep violations per sector per cycle to maintain departmental efficiency ratings. Units achieving sub-quota performance face resource reduction and personnel reassignment. Optimal enforcement focuses on multiple violation subjects who demonstrate pattern resistance to sleep privilege compliance. The quotas create bureaucratic pressure to criminalize rest itself, transforming exhausted workers into statistical resources for maintaining departmental performance rather than citizens deserving protection. The enforcement system operates like a harvesting operation, extracting arrests from populations whose desperation makes them reliable sources of violations, regardless of their actual threat to imperial security. The coordination between official enforcement and commercial protection services becomes explicit in the legal frameworks that exempt protection service customers from sleep violation enforcement during purchased security periods. Workers who pay for commercial protection receive temporary legal immunity from rest-related arrests, while those who cannot afford purchased security face systematic criminalization for attempting the same biological function. This creates a perfect integration between commercial and official exploitation. Protection services sell temporary legal immunity rather than actual security, while official enforcement provides market pressure that drives protection service sales through systematic criminalization of unprotected rest attempts. The institutional logic reveals itself with bureaucratic clarity. Sleep has become a managed resource that generates revenue through commercial protection sales and enforcement statistics through systematic violation arrests. The system treats rest as an economic transaction rather than a biological necessity, creating populations trapped between commercial exploitation and official persecution for attempting to satisfy basic human needs. In the Underhive, official law enforcement has evolved into another category of sleep predator, more systematic and sustainable than criminal alternatives, using bureaucratic authority to transform exhaustion into compliance and rest into a privilege that must be purchased from the same commercial networks that coordinate with enforcement agencies to maintain optimal population vulnerability. The workers face predation from criminals who hunt their unconsciousness, exploitation from commercial services that sell managed protection from those criminals, and persecution from official agencies that criminalize their attempts to achieve the rest they need to survive. Each system reinforces the others, creating perfect conditions for institutional control through manufactured desperation. The institutional machinery that criminalizes rest creates populations whose immune systems collapse under systematic exhaustion. opening biological pathways for predation that operates according to evolutionary logic rather than criminal opportunity. When human bodies cannot achieve the deep sleep necessary for cellular repair and immune function maintenance, they become incubators for diseases that have adapted specifically to exploit the vulnerability that chronic sleep deprivation creates. The respiratory infections emerge first, targeting workers whose lung capacity has been compromised by months of microsleep survival in atmospheres thick with industrial toxins. Pneumonic decay syndrome manifests exclusively in populations subjected to fewer than 4 hours of continuous sleep per cycle, attacking alveolar tissue during the shallow breathing patterns that characterize exhausted unconsciousness. The disease requires specific conditions to achieve maximum virulence: reduced oxygen intake, elevated stress hormones, and the suppressed immune responses that result from systematic sleep deprivation. Medicae biologists. Theron Vask's classified pathology reports document the precision with which PDS targets sleeping victims. The bacterial strain demonstrates dormancy during waking hours, activating only when host respiratory patterns indicate unconsciousness, deeper than the vigilant microsleep most workers maintain for survival. The timing suggests evolutionary adaptation that exploits exactly the vulnerability created by underhive architectural systems and enforcement policies that prevent genuine rest. But respiratory infections represent only the most obvious category of sleep-specific biological predation. The neural parasites demonstrate evolutionary sophistication that borders on the supernatural, targeting the specific brainwave patterns associated with REM sleep phases that chronically exhausted populations rarely achieve. Cortical consumption's parasites remain undetectable during standard medical examinations, manifesting symptoms only during deep unconsciousness, when hosts finally achieve the neural recovery cycles their biology demands. The parasites feed on the electrochemical activity that characterizes dream states, consuming the neural resources necessary for memory consolidation and psychological repair. Victims experience progressive cognitive degradation that appears unrelated to parasitic infection until post-mortem examination reveals the characteristic neural tissue damage that occurs exclusively during REM sleep predation. Medical examiner Castor Veron's autopsy protocols document the parasitic life cycle with clinical precision. CCP organisms require minimum 47 minutes of continuous REM activity to complete reproductive cycles. Host neural tissue shows consumption patterns consistent with systematic feeding during dream states. Subjects achieving insufficient REM sleep demonstrate parasitic dormancy, but progressive neural degradation from metabolic waste accumulation. The biological timing creates perfect evolutionary pressure. Populations that never achieve deep sleep remain infected but non-symptomatic, serving as carriers who spread parasites to other potential hosts. Those who finally achieve the rest, their bodies require trigger parasitic reproduction cycles that consume the neural tissue necessary for recovery, ensuring that deep sleep becomes directly lethal, while exhaustion provides survival through biological stasis. The skin-boring beetles represent the most visibly horrific category of sleep-specific predation, their life cycle calibrated to exploit the reduced tactile awareness that characterizes human unconsciousness. The beetles deposit larvae in hair follicles and skin pores during periods when hosts cannot detect the minimal pain associated with initial infestation. The larvae remain dormant until host body temperature and respiration patterns indicate deep sleep, then begin systematic consumption of subcutaneous tissue. The feeding patterns follow the sleep cycles that exhausted workers struggle to achieve. Surface tissue consumption occurs during light sleep phases, creating minor irritation that wakes hosts before significant damage occurs. But deep tissue consumption requires the prolonged unconsciousness that only workers achieving genuine rest experience, creating infestations that consume muscle tissue and internal organs while victims remain unable to wake. Entomological specialist Mordian Vex documented the beetle life cycle in reports sealed under Biological Hazard Protocol 7. Dermal consumption rates correlate directly with host unconsciousness depth and duration. Subjects maintaining vigilant microsleep demonstrate minimal tissue loss and high survival rates. Deep sleep subjects show complete subcutaneous consumption within 6 to 8 hours of infestation activation. The mathematical precision suggests evolutionary adaptation guided by selective pressure that rewards predation of well-rested populations while preserving exhausted hosts who serve as breeding reservoirs. The beetles have evolved to maintain optimal prey populations by consuming those who achieve recovery, while preserving those whose exhaustion makes them sustainable carriers. But the most disturbing biological predators operate at the genetic level, targeting the cellular repair mechanisms that function exclusively during deep sleep phases. Chromosomal degradation syndrome manifests as systematic DNA damage that occurs when viral agents exploit the specific cellular vulnerability created by sleep deprivation. The virus remains inactive in hosts whose cells never achieve the repair cycles that require sustained unconsciousness, but triggers catastrophic genetic breakdown in populations that finally achieve recovery sleep. The viral mechanism creates impossible biological arithmetic. Cells damaged by chronic exhaustion require deep sleep to activate repair mechanisms, but the repair process creates vulnerability to viral predation that causes immediate cellular death. Workers who maintain exhaustion survive through biological stasis, while those who achieve rest trigger genetic breakdown that kills within hours of recovery, sleep onset. Geneticist Vos Corridan's classified viral analysis reveals the systematic precision. CDS viral. Loads remain stable in subjects maintaining sleep deprivation, stress hormones above threshold levels. Viral activation occurs within 12 minutes of deep sleep onset, targeting DNA repair mechanisms during their most active metabolic phases. Host cellular death follows complete chromosomal degradation within 4 to 6 hours. The viral targeting creates populations trapped in permanent exhaustion as the only alternative to immediate genetic death. The disease has evolved to exploit exactly the biological recovery mechanisms that chronic sleep deprivation disables, ensuring that rest itself becomes a trigger for cellular suicide. Yet the most revealing pattern emerges from the coordinated timing of biological predation across different pathogenic categories. Respiratory infections, neural parasites, skin-boring beetles, and chromosomal viruses demonstrate synchronized activation cycles that suggest communication between species or guidance by external intelligence. The biological predators appear to coordinate their attacks to maximize tissue harvest while maintaining sustainable host populations. The synchronization requires environmental cues that extend beyond simple biological adaptation. The pathogens respond to the same atmospheric maintenance phases that torment sleepers, activate during the same lunar cycles that coordinate criminal predation, and demonstrate virulence patterns that correlate with official enforcement schedules. The biological predation appears integrated with institutional systems that monitor and regulate sleep patterns across underhive populations. Pathological coordinator Thane Vex's sealed reports document the institutional integration. Biological outbreak patterns demonstrate 73% correlation with documented sleep surveillance data. Pathogen activation rates increase during official rest monitoring phases and protection service operational periods. Disease vectors appear responsive to environmental conditions that require technological rather than natural coordination. The correlation suggests that biological predation operates as another component of the systematic exploitation that transforms sleep from biological necessity into managed vulnerability. The diseases have evolved, or been engineered, to reinforce the same population control mechanisms that criminal predators, protection services, and official enforcement use to maintain optimal exploitation conditions. The biological tax extracted from exhausted populations serves multiple institutional purposes. It eliminates workers who achieve enough rest to resist systematic exploitation, maintains disease pressure that drives demand for medical services controlled by the same commercial networks that operate protection services, and creates biological weapons that can be deployed against populations through the simple act of permitting them access to the sleep their bodies require. In the underhive, even the microscopic ecosystem has learned to hunt human unconsciousness with precision that suggests coordination with the larger machinery of exploitation. The workers face predation from organisms that have evolved to make rest itself lethal, while exhaustion provides the only available survival strategy. A biological trap that reinforces every other system designed to prevent human sleep, while profiting from the desperation that systematic exhaustion creates. The biological predators that exploit sleeping populations operate in perfect coordination with an acoustic warfare system that has transformed the underhive's sonic environment into a weapon designed to fragment human consciousness. Where disease organisms target the cellular repair mechanisms that require deep sleep, the industrial soundscape attacks the neurological processes that initiate rest itself, creating populations whose exhausted minds cannot achieve the unconsciousness necessary for recovery, or for falling prey to the biological predation that waits in the deeper phases of sleep. The industrial machinery operates on rotating shift schedules that maintain constant acoustic assault across all residential areas. Manufacturing output requires 24-hour production cycles, but the timing of high-decibel operations follows patterns that suggest coordination with population rest schedules rather than production efficiency. Heavy forging operations peak during documented sleep hours. Plasma cutting systems activate during the precise windows when exhausted workers finally achieve unconsciousness. Steam venting procedures occur with clockwork precision during the micro-sleep episodes that represent workers' only access to neural recovery. Acoustic engineer Dorian Vess documented the systematic nature of industrial noise coordination in classified reports filed under Sonic Warfare Protocol Delta. The machinery noise reaches peak intensity at 127 decibels during residential rest periods, precisely the acoustic threshold required to prevent REM sleep onset while maintaining plausible industrial necessity. The timing proves too consistent across multiple production facilities to represent coincidental scheduling. But the acoustic assault extends beyond mere industrial byproduct into deliberate sonic weapons deployed through the same infrastructure that provides official communication to under-Hive populations. The propaganda broadcast systems that relay imperial edicts and productivity announcements operate according to transmission schedules designed to disrupt rather than inform. Emergency alert signals trigger during statistical sleep peak hours with sufficient frequency to condition populations against attempting rest during officially designated quiet periods. The psychological conditioning operates through carefully calibrated acoustic trauma that associates unconsciousness with immediate threat response. Workers who achieve microsleep episodes learn to associate rest with the shriek of emergency signals, the crash of industrial equipment, or the amplified voices of enforcement personnel conducting proximity sweeps. The conditioning creates neurological responses that trigger alertness reflexes whenever exhaustion approaches the threshold of genuine sleep. Sonic Warfare Specialist Kani Vorth's classified operational manual details the acoustic precisions required to maintain optimal population exhaustion. Target frequencies must achieve sleep disruption without triggering permanent auditory damage that reduces workforce productivity. Optimal acoustic assault maintains subjects in perpetual pre-sleep states without reducing their capacity for assigned labor duties. The manual reads like a torture guide disguised as industrial policy, complete with technical specifications for sound levels, frequency patterns, and timing cycles designed to prevent rest while preserving minimal functionality necessary for economic exploitation. The acoustic weapons operate with the same systematic precision as biological predators, targeting specific phases of human consciousness with scientific accuracy. The most sophisticated acoustic weapons emerge from the residential infrastructure itself, using the same architectural systems that amplify environmental threats to transform every surface into a transmission medium for sleep prevention technology. The pressed metal walls that amplify criminal predator movements also serve as acoustic conduits for subsonic frequencies that disrupt neural patterns associated with sleep onset. The ventilation systems that fail during rest periods double as speakers for frequencies below conscious hearing that trigger stress responses incompatible with unconsciousness. The subsonic assault operates below the threshold of conscious detection while triggering physiological responses that make sleep impossible to achieve. Heart rate elevation, adrenaline production, and muscle tension increase during exposure to frequencies that residents cannot consciously perceive, but that their nervous systems interpret as immediate threats requiring vigilant alertness. Neurological acoustics researcher Vex Mordian's sealed studies document the subsonic precision. Frequencies between 14 to 19 Hz trigger involuntary stress responses that prevent sleep onset without conscious awareness of acoustic stimulus. Subject populations demonstrate 89% reduction in successful rest attempts during subsonic transmission periods, while reporting no awareness of environmental sound changes. The subliminal acoustic weapons create perfect population control through biological manipulation that remains invisible to victims who experience systematic exhaustion without understanding its technological causes. The workers attribute their inability to sleep to personal weakness, environmental stress, or criminal threats while remaining unaware of the subsonic broadcasts that make rest physiologically impossible to achieve. But the most disturbing aspect of acoustic warfare lies in the economic infrastructure built around commercially available silence. The black market in soundproof materials, white noise generators, and acoustic dampening equipment operates with pricing structures calibrated to extract maximum revenue from populations desperate for brief respites from systematic acoustic assault. The silent sellers offer temporary relief from sound weapons while maintaining perfect coordination with the institutions that deploy those weapons. Commercial silence vendors demonstrate knowledge of acoustic weapon deployment schedules, offering sound sanctuary services during specific time windows when subsonic broadcasts reduce intensity enough to permit purchased rest periods. The coordination suggests that commercial silence operations serve as authorized pressure release valves for acoustic weapon systems rather than genuine alternatives to systematic sonic assault. The pricing follows the same economic logic as protection services. Acoustic relief costs precisely what desperate workers can afford to pay, while never providing enough genuine silence to permit escape from acoustic weapon vulnerability. Entry-level sound dampening provides minimal protection during low-intensity transmission periods. Premium acoustic shielding offers temporary immunity during high-intensity operations, but costs enough to maintain customer dependency rather than permanent relief. Acoustic Relief Coordinator Senna Vex's commercial operational reports reveal the systematic integration. Silence services require coordination with official transmission schedules to ensure customer satisfaction without reducing overall population acoustic exposure below optimal exhaustion maintenance levels. Premium services provide genuine relief during designated low transmission windows while maintaining market pressure through continued high-intensity operations. The commercial silence industry operates as another component of managed exploitation, selling temporary relief from acoustic weapons while maintaining the overall sonic assault necessary to preserve population exhaustion and commercial dependency. The vendors profit from systematic acoustic torture, while ensuring that torture remains systematic enough to generate sustainable revenue streams. The acoustic weapons achieve perfect integration with every other exploitation system that targets sleep vulnerability. The timing coordinates with protection service operations, enforcement sweep schedules, and biological predator activation cycles. The subsonic frequencies reinforce the architectural hostility that prevents rest. The commercial silence markets create additional economic pressure that maintains populations in optimal exploitation conditions. Most significantly, acoustic surveillance systems monitor population response to sonic assault with the same precision used to track sleep patterns and biological predation. The sound weapons include feedback, mechanisms that measure stress responses, sleep attempt frequencies, and neurological adaptation patterns. The acoustic assault adapts to population resistance, increasing intensity when workers develop tolerance and shifting frequencies when nervous systems adapt to specific sonic attacks. Acoustic Surveillance Coordinator Voss Thane's classified monitoring reports document the adaptive precision. Population sonic responses require continuous recalibration to maintain optimal exhaustion levels without triggering system-wide resistance or productivity collapse. Acoustic weapons demonstrate maximum effectiveness when deployed in coordination with other sleep prevention systems through synchronized timing and frequency coordination. The coordination transforms the entire underhive into a sophisticated acoustic weapon system that adapts to population resistance while maintaining perfect integration with criminal predation, commercial exploitation, and official persecution. The sound itself has become weaponized through technological systems that operate with institutional authority and commercial support. Workers who survive criminal predators, avoid biological infection, resist commercial exploitation, and evade official persecution still face acoustic weapons that make rest physiologically impossible while remaining invisible to conscious detection. The sonic assault represents the most comprehensive and inescapable component of systematic sleep prevention, operating through infrastructure that touches every aspect of underhive existence. The acoustic warfare creates conditions that make every other form of exploitation more effective while remaining plausibly deniable as industrial necessity rather than deliberate population control. The sound weapons prepare victims for predation while maintaining the systematic exhaustion that makes commercial and official exploitation possible. As reports filter through unofficial channels of increased Arbeits mobilization and enhanced acoustic surveillance deployment, the sonic assault appears to be escalating toward something more comprehensive than routine population management. The frequency and intensity of acoustic weapons suggest preparation for operations that require maximum population disorientation and minimal capacity for coordinated resistance. The sound of systematic exhaustion grows louder as enforcement resources mass for operations that promise to demonstrate the full integration of every exploitation system that has evolved to prey upon human sleep vulnerability. The escalating acoustic assault serves as preparation for coordinated enforcement operations that demonstrate the full integration of every system designed to exploit sleep vulnerability. The increased Arbeits mobilization, enhanced surveillance deployment, and systematic acoustic weaponization converge during what official documents euphemistically term comprehensive population compliance verification, massive sweep, operations that transform entire residential blocks into laboratories for testing the effectiveness of systematic exhaustion as a tool for population control. Residential block Gamma 7 houses 14,000 workers across 43 HAB levels, their sleep patterns monitored with industrial precision by surveillance systems that track every micro-sleep episode, every rest attempt, and every moment of unconsciousness achieved despite architectural hostility, biological predation, and acoustic assault. The surveillance data reveals population resistance patterns that have developed over months of systematic sleep prevention. Workers adapting to subsonic frequencies, developing immunity to certain biological predators, and creating informal cooperation networks that provide minimal protection against criminal exploitation. The adaptation represents exactly the kind of systematic resistance that requires demonstration of institutional authority through overwhelming force deployment. When exhausted populations begin developing survival strategies that reduce their vulnerability to managed exploitation, the institutional response must reassert control through operations that eliminate adaptation while reinforcing dependency on authorized protection and commercial security services. The operation begins at 0347 hours during statistical peak sleep period, when surveillance data indicates maximum population unconsciousness despite systematic prevention efforts. The timing exploits the few minutes of genuine rest that even the most exhausted workers occasionally achieve when acoustic weapons reduce intensity. Biological predators enter dormancy phases, and criminal hunters rotate between target areas. Sonic charges detonate simultaneously across all 43 HAB levels, triggering structural failures in load-bearing supports weakened by months of maintenance neglect during resident sleep periods. The explosions follow acoustic assault protocols designed to maximize disorientation while maintaining plausible deniability as infrastructure failures rather than deliberate attacks on sleeping populations. The sound signature matches industrial accidents closely enough to prevent official acknowledgement of warfare against civilian rest. The structural collapses occur with mathematical precision, targeting the specific sleeping locations identified through months of surveillance data, while preserving corridor access routes necessary for enforcement personnel to navigate through the debris. Workers who have adapted to sleeping in marginally safer positions find their refuges eliminated through explosions timed to their individual rest patterns, while escape routes remain clear for enforcement teams equipped with advanced knowledge of structural failure patterns. The Arbeits teams advance through predetermined routes cleared by sonic charges, their approach masked by the acoustic chaos of collapsing infrastructure and emergency response systems. They carry specialized equipment designed for operations in environments of systematic exhaustion. Stimulant injectors to maintain alertness in personnel subjected to acoustic assault, respiratory filters to prevent exposure to biological weapons deployed through ventilation systems, and portable sound dampeners that provide acoustic protection for enforcement personnel while maintaining sonic assault against civilian populations. But the most revealing aspect of the enforcement operation lies in the coordination with civilian predator networks that suggests institutional sanction rather than simple law enforcement activity. Criminal gangs operate alongside Arbeits units, using official protection to conduct recruitment and organ harvesting operations under cover of legitimate enforcement activity. The predators follow the same operational protocols as official personnel, demonstrate identical knowledge of surveillance data and structural vulnerabilities, and coordinate their activities with precision that indicates shared command authority. The biological weapons deployment occurs through the same ventilation systems that have tormented residents for months, but with concentrations designed to achieve immediate incapacitation rather than gradual weakening. Paralytic agents released through atmospheric maintenance systems target workers attempting to flee through predetermined escape routes, creating unconscious victims perfectly positioned for official arrest or criminal predation according to pre-established selection criteria. The selection follows economic logic that reveals the true purpose of comprehensive population compliance verification. Workers with commercial protection service contracts receive priority processing for official detention rather than criminal predation, while unprotected residents become available for gang recruitment or organ harvest, according to predetermined quotas. The operation sorts populations based on their economic relationship to authorized exploitation systems rather than their actual compliance with Imperial law. The most disturbing coordination occurs between enforcement personnel and ecclesiarch representatives who provide religious justification for the systematic brutalization of exhausted civilians. Confessor Malefic Vren delivers benedictions over unconscious workers before their transfer to processing facilities, blessing the violence as necessary correction of spiritual weakness that manifests through excessive sleep requirements. The religious framework transforms systematic torture into pious duty while providing bureaucratic cover for operations that eliminate populations showing resistance to commercial and official exploitation. The processing procedures that follow demonstrate industrial efficiency in transforming sleep vulnerability into permanent compliance. Workers who survive the initial assault face systematic sleep deprivation in detention facilities designed to break any remaining resistance to commercial protection services, official surveillance, and institutional authority. The processing creates populations whose desperation guarantees future dependency on exactly the systems that coordinated their brutalization. Yet the operation reveals systematic limitations that suggest institutional concern about population resistance patterns developing beyond manageable levels. The enforcement requires massive resource deployment, coordination between multiple agencies and commercial services, and religious justification for activities that approach open warfare against civilian populations. The scale suggests that systematic sleep prevention has created resistance that requires increasingly violent suppression to maintain effective population control. The aftermath documentation shows enforcement statistics that appear successful according to official metrics: arrest quotas achieved, resistance networks eliminated, and population compliance restored to optimal levels for continued commercial and institutional exploitation. But the deeper surveillance data reveals adaptation patterns that suggest the operation may have eliminated immediate resistance while creating conditions for more sophisticated future opposition. The workers who survive systematic brutalization during comprehensive compliance verification understand that their exhaustion serves institutional purposes beyond simple labor extraction. They recognize that their sleep vulnerability has been weaponized by systems that coordinate criminal predation, commercial exploitation, and official persecution through shared surveillance infrastructure and operational planning. Block Gamma 7 becomes a demonstration site for the full integration of every system designed to prevent human rest, while profiting from the desperation that systematic exhaustion creates. The operation proves that sleep itself has become a battleground where institutional authority uses overwhelming force to maintain populations in optimal conditions for sustained exploitation. The enforcement action concludes with enhanced surveillance deployment and expanded commercial security operations that promise to prevent future resistance while maintaining the systematic sleep prevention that makes such resistance necessary for basic survival. The religious justification that sanctifies systematic brutalization of exhausted populations emerges from theological interpretations that have evolved to support the institutional machinery of sleep prevention. Confessor Malefic Vren's benedictions over unconscious workers represent more than ceremonial validation. They reflect Imperial Creed doctrine that has been systematically reinterpreted to cast sleep itself as a form of spiritual rebellion against the Emperor's divine mandate for eternal vigilance. The doctrinal framework originates from Ecclesiarch canonical interpretation, 1247 Tertius, which redefines the traditional imperial virtue of watchfulness as a literal requirement for continuous consciousness. The interpretation transforms metaphorical spiritual alertness into mandatory physical wakefulness, creating religious obligation that criminalizes basic biological function while providing theological cover for systematic torture disguised as pious correction. The canonical reinterpretation operates through careful manipulation of established imperial texts. Where traditional doctrine speaks of vigilance against the enemies of mankind, the new interpretation specifies continuous physical alertness as demonstration of spiritual dedication. Where classical texts reference watchfulness in the face of heretical corruption, contemporary doctrine mandates sustained consciousness as protection against warp infiltration through unguarded sleep states. The theological logic creates religious justification for every component of systematic sleep prevention while casting resistance as heretical rebellion against divine authority. Workers who attempt rest demonstrate spiritual weakness that requires correction through institutional violence. Populations that develop adaptation strategies reveal heretical cooperation that demands purification through comprehensive enforcement operations. Brother Chaplain Mordecus Vex sealed theological analysis documents the doctrinal sophistication. Sleep represents voluntary surrender of consciousness that creates vulnerability to chaos infiltration through unguarded dream states. Extended unconsciousness demonstrates insufficient faith in the Emperor's protection and constitutes passive collaboration with warp entities seeking access to imperial citizens through reduced mental defenses. The analysis provides perfect religious framework for institutional policies that treat exhaustion as spiritual strength and rest as theological failure. The doctrine transforms systematic torture into religious duty while creating populations whose desperation makes them psychologically dependent on institutional authority for protection against threats. The doctrine itself defines as emanating from their basic biological needs. The practical implementation of vigilance doctrine occurs through ecclesiarch liturgical services that coordinate with enforcement operations and commercial exploitation systems. Prayer schedules require attendance during statistical sleep peak hours, forcing workers to choose between religious compliance and biological necessity. Devotional exercises demand physical participation that prevents rest while providing spiritual justification for the acoustic assault, architectural hostility, and biological predation that make unconsciousness impossible to achieve. The most revealing aspect of vigilance doctrine lies in its specific focus on dream states as vectors for supernatural corruption. The theological framework identifies sleep not merely as spiritual weakness, but as active doorway for warp entities seeking to infiltrate imperial populations through unguarded consciousness. The doctrine provides religious explanation for institutional policies that might otherwise appear as systematic cruelty by casting sleep prevention as desperate protection against threats too terrible for civilian comprehension. Theologian militant Cassius Vaughan's classified doctrinal studies reveal the supernatural dimension. Warp entities demonstrate documented preference for dream state infiltration, exploiting reduced mental defenses during REM sleep phases to establish psychological footholds that enable possession, corruption, and heretical conversion. Sleep prevention serves as primary defense against chaos infiltration through unconscious vulnerability. The theological analysis suggests that institutional sleep prevention may represent genuine attempts to protect populations from supernatural threats rather than simple exploitation disguised as religious duty. The doctrine implies knowledge of warp-based predation that uses human dreams as attack vectors, making systematic exhaustion a form of spiritual warfare rather than economic oppression. Yet the implementation of vigilance doctrine reveals coordination with commercial and criminal exploitation that suggests more complex motivations than simple protection against supernatural threats. The religious schedules that prevent sleep coordinate perfectly with protection service operations, enforcement sweep timing, and biological predator activation cycles. The theological framework appears designed to provide religious justification for systematic exploitation rather than genuine defense against warp infiltration. The doctrinal services themselves demonstrate this coordination through timing that maximizes commercial and official revenue generation. Prayer sessions occur during periods when protection services offer premium rates for spiritual security. Devotional requirements increase during enforcement operations that generate maximum arrest quotas. Religious obligations intensify during commercial silence, vendor peak business periods. Ecclesiarch Revenue Coordinator Thane Vex's sealed financial reports document the economic integration. Vigilance doctrine implementation correlates with 67% increase in protection service revenues, 43% increase in enforcement citation income, and 89% increase in commercial security sales. Religious compliance requirements create optimal market conditions for authorized exploitation services. The economic coordination reveals vigilance doctrine as sophisticated psychological manipulation that uses religious authority to maintain population dependency on commercial and institutional systems. The doctrine creates spiritual obligation that reinforces every other exploitation mechanism while providing theological cover for systematic brutalization disguised as pious protection. The psychological effects of vigilance doctrine prove more devastating than physical exhaustion alone. Workers subjected to religious indoctrination that defines their basic biological needs as spiritual failure develop internalized shame that prevents resistance to systematic exploitation. They interpret their exhaustion as personal weakness rather than institutional violence, their desperation as spiritual inadequacy rather than manufactured vulnerability. The internalization creates perfect psychological conditions for sustained exploitation. Populations that blame themselves for their suffering rather than their oppressors become psychologically incapable of organized resistance, while remaining emotionally dependent on institutional authority for protection against threats the authority itself creates and manages. Behavioral psychologist Wes Corridan's classified population studies document the psychological precision. Subjects exposed to vigilance doctrine demonstrate 78% reduction in resistance behaviors, 91% increase in compliance with exploitation systems, and complete internalization of responsibility for systematic brutalization. Religious framework creates psychological dependency that eliminates resistance while maximizing commercial revenue generation. The psychological manipulation transforms victims into willing participants in their own exploitation while providing religious justification for institutional policies that approach genocide through systematic prevention of basic biological function. The doctrine creates populations that desire their own oppression while remaining convinced that such oppression represents divine protection against supernatural threats. But the most disturbing aspect of vigilance doctrine emerges from theological texts that suggest genuine knowledge of warp-based threats that use sleep as attack vectors. The religious framework may provide cover for exploitation systems, but the underlying supernatural concerns appear to reflect real institutional knowledge of chaos infiltration attempts that target unconscious populations through dream state vulnerability. The doctrine implies that systematic sleep prevention serves dual purposes, protecting populations from genuine supernatural threats while creating optimal conditions for commercial and official exploitation of populations too exhausted to resist institutional authority. The religious framework transforms necessary spiritual warfare into profitable population management, while maintaining plausible theological justification for systematic brutalization. In the Underhive, vigilance doctrine creates populations that view their systematic torture as divine protection while generating revenue streams that fund the expansion of exploitation systems disguised as spiritual defense. The workers pray for protection from threats that manifest through their basic biological needs, while paying for commercial security from dangers created by the same institutional authority that provides their religious instruction. The theology has evolved to serve institutional power while providing genuine spiritual framework for warfare against supernatural enemies that may actually exist beyond the manufactured threats used to justify systematic exploitation of exhausted populations, seeking nothing more dangerous than basic human rest. The theological warnings about warp infiltration through unguarded dreams prove more prescient than the commercial exploitation systems that profit from them. Beyond the manufactured threats used to justify systematic sleep prevention lies genuine supernatural predation that operates through exactly the vulnerability that vigilance doctrine claims to address. The institutions that transform exhaustion into revenue streams have built their exploitation apparatus around real dangers that hunt human consciousness through the liminal space between waking and sleeping. Dangers that make the criminal predators, biological threats, and official persecution appear almost benign by comparison. The documented cases begin appearing in Inquisition archives during the same period that commercial protection services and official enforcement operations achieve maximum coordination. Incident Report Tertius Delta 7739 describes the first confirmed case of warp-influenced dream predation in residential block Gamma 7. Worker designation 4472-Vex found in catalonic state, following 4.7 hours of documented deep sleep, exhibiting neural patterns consistent with psychic assault and memory extraction by entities operating through REM sleep vulnerability. The victim's neurological examination reveals damage patterns impossible to achieve through conventional means. Specific memory engrams have been surgically excised from neural tissue while leaving surrounding cognitive function intact. The precision suggests intelligence capable of navigating human consciousness with surgical accuracy, extracting information or implanting influence, while leaving minimal trace of intervention beyond the catastrophic psychological damage that manifests when victims attempt to access compromised memory structures. Interrogator Psyker Vashti Kaney's classified analysis documents the psychic signature. Warp entity access achieved through prolonged REM sleep. Phases demonstrates intelligence and capability that exceeds documented demon manifestation patterns. Entity demonstrated selective memory manipulation, emotional conditioning implantation, and behavioral modification protocols that suggest systematic psychological warfare rather than opportunistic predation. The psychic analysis reveals sophisticated supernatural operations that use sleep as a vector for infiltration campaigns targeting specific individuals based on detailed knowledge of their psychological profiles, social connections, and institutional access. The entities demonstrate preparation and intelligence gathering that suggests coordination with information sources beyond simple warp-based omniscience. The pattern expands across multiple residential blocks with mathematical precision that mirrors the systematic coordination between commercial exploitation and official enforcement. Warp infiltration incidents cluster during periods when surveillance systems document maximum population rest attempts, suggesting supernatural entities using the same sleep pattern data that enables criminal predation and official persecution. But the supernatural predation operates according to selection criteria that reveal strategic intelligence rather than random hunting behavior. The entities target workers with specific skill sets, social connections, and institutional access, rather than simply attacking the most vulnerable sleep attempts. The predation follows intelligence priorities that suggest coordination with terrestrial sources, providing detailed population analysis and strategic target identification. Inquisitor Malleus Vorian Tech's sealed investigation reports document the systematic nature. Warp entity target selection demonstrates knowledge of Imperial administrative structures, production facility access protocols, and individual worker psychological profiles that requires intelligence coordination with terrestrial sources. Supernatural predation serves strategic objectives that extend beyond simple soul harvest into systematic infiltration of Imperial infrastructure. The investigation reveals that warp entities use dream state access to implant behavioral modifications, extract classified information, and establish psychological control networks that enable long-term manipulation of Imperial personnel. The supernatural predation creates sleeper agents whose compromised consciousness provides ongoing access for entities operating through psychic influence rather than direct manifestation. The most disturbing discovery emerges from cross-referencing warp infiltration patterns with commercial protection service operations. Workers who purchase premium security from providers claiming supernatural protection protocols demonstrate immunity to warp predation during contracted coverage periods, suggesting that commercial services possess genuine capability to defend against supernatural threats, rather than simply exploiting manufactured fears. The protection services employ personnel with undocumented psychic abilities deploy equipment that registers as technological rather than purely commercial, and coordinate their operations with precision that suggests access to Inquisition-level intelligence about warp entity activities. The commercial operations appear to serve as authorized front organizations for counter-daemon activities that require operational security incompatible with official Imperial bureaucracy. Protection Service Coordinator Vex Mordian's classified operational directives reveal the true nature. Anti-demon protocols require commercial cover to maintain operational security necessary for counter-infiltration activities. Official Imperial response to warp threats creates bureaucratic delays that enable entity escape before containment procedures achieve effectiveness. Commercial operations provide responsive capability while maintaining plausible deniability for necessary violence. The commercial services operate as unofficial Inquisition assets, providing genuine protection against supernatural threats while generating revenue streams that fund expanded counter-daemon operations. The protection rackets serve dual purposes, exploiting population desperation for commercial profit while maintaining rapid response capability against warp infiltration attempts that official Imperial bureaucracy cannot address with sufficient speed or discretion. The coordination extends to enforcement operations that target populations showing signs of warp influence rather than simple sleep violation. The comprehensive compliance verification conducted in Block Gamma 7 serves as cover for systematic screening that identifies compromised individuals while providing religious justification for elimination procedures disguised as law enforcement activity. The Arbites personnel involved in the operation include undocumented specialists trained in psychic threat detection, equipped with technology designed for supernatural rather than conventional threats, and operating under protocols that prioritize elimination of warp-influenced targets over standard arrest procedures. The enforcement serves as counter-infiltration operations disguised as population compliance verification. Yet the most revealing aspect of counter-daemon operations lies in their integration with systematic sleep prevention that appears to serve protection rather than exploitation. The institutional policies that prevent deep sleep may represent desperate attempts to limit warp entity access rather than simple population control, with commercial exploitation serving as cover for necessary spiritual warfare against supernatural enemies that require complete operational security. Inquisitor Tech's final analysis suggests the horrifying possibility. Systematic sleep prevention may represent optimal defense against warp infiltration capabilities that exceed current Imperial counter-daemon protocols. Population exhaustion serves as primary protection against supernatural predation that demonstrates adaptation to conventional spiritual defenses through exploitation of dream state vulnerability. The analysis implies that every component of systematic sleep prevention, architectural hostility, biological predation, acoustic assault, commercial exploitation, and official persecution may serve as necessary components of counter-daemon operations that protect Imperial populations from supernatural threats too sophisticated for conventional defense, while maintaining operational security through apparent systematic oppression. The institutional apparatus that transforms sleep into managed vulnerability operates as cover for spiritual warfare against enemies that have evolved to exploit human consciousness through exactly the biological function that seems most innocent and necessary. The workers who suffer systematic brutalization in pursuit of basic rest may be protected by that same brutalization from supernatural predation that would destroy not just their bodies, but their souls. In the Underhive, the machinery of exploitation that prevents human sleep may represent the only effective defense against warp entities that hunt through dreams with intelligence and capability that exceeds every other threat that stalks exhausted populations. The systematic torture disguised as commerce and law enforcement serves as camouflage for counter-demon operations that require complete operational security to maintain effectiveness against supernatural enemies adapting to Imperial defenses. The workers remain ignorant of their role as protected assets in spiritual warfare that uses their systematic suffering as both shield and weapon against threats that would consume their consciousness through the very dreams they desperately seek but can never safely achieve. The counter-demon operations that masquerade as systematic exploitation have achieved their primary objective with mathematical precision. The creation of human populations physiologically adapted to existence without the deep sleep that provides access vectors for warp entity infiltration. But adaptation to systematic sleep prevention has triggered evolutionary changes that transform Homo sapiens into something fundamentally different. Populations whose neurological development has been permanently altered by generations of enforced exhaustion. The children born in the Underhive demonstrate cognitive architectures that reflect systematic adaptation to micro-sleep survival rather than normal human rest cycles. Their developing nervous systems have evolved to function on fragmented consciousness patterns, achieving neural efficiency through distributed processing rather than the consolidated memory formation that requires sustained unconsciousness. The adaptation represents successful biological defense against supernatural predation, but at the cost of fundamental changes to human neurological development. Pediatric neurologist Wes Corridan's classified developmental studies document the systematic changes. Second-generation subjects demonstrate 43% reduction in neural structures associated with REM sleep processing, 67% increase in micro-alertness neural pathways, and complete elimination of deep sleep dependency for cognitive function maintenance. Subjects achieve neural efficiency through consciousness fragmentation rather than consolidated rest cycles. The neurological adaptation creates populations capable of indefinite survival on micro-sleep cycles, while losing the capacity for deep unconsciousness that normal human psychology requires for emotional regulation, creative thinking, and long-term memory consolidation. The children function as optimal workers, alert, compliant, and physiologically incapable of achieving the rest states that provide vulnerability to warp infiltration. But they represent a divergent species, rather than adapted humans. The psychological changes prove even more significant than neurological adaptation. The sleepless generations demonstrate emotional responses calibrated to systematic exhaustion as baseline normal rather than crisis condition. They interpret perpetual vigilance as natural human behavior, institutional violence as protective care, and commercial exploitation as beneficial service provision. Their psychological development reflects adaptation to conditions that would destroy normal human populations. The adaptation creates perfect populations for sustained exploitation while providing optimal protection against supernatural threats that target normal human consciousness through dream state vulnerability. The sleepless generations serve institutional purposes with efficiency that approaches mechanical precision while remaining physiologically immune to warp entity infiltration attempts that depend on deep sleep access. Behavioral development specialist Mordian Vex's longitudinal studies reveal the comprehensive adaptation. Third-generation subjects demonstrate complete psychological integration with systematic exploitation systems, interpreting sleep prevention as protective service rather than institutional violence. Subjects express gratitude for exhaustion, maintenance, and anxiety when exposed to rest opportunities that exceed microsleep parameters. The psychological adaptation eliminates resistance to systematic exploitation, while creating populations whose survival depends entirely on institutional systems that maintain optimal exhaustion levels. The sleepless generations cannot survive in environments that permit normal human rest cycles, making them permanently dependent on the same exploitation apparatus that created their evolutionary adaptation. But the most revealing changes emerge in social development patterns that reflect systematic elimination of cooperative behaviors associated with normal human community formation. The sleepless generations demonstrate individual survival strategies that prevent collective resistance while maintaining optimal productivity for institutional exploitation. They have evolved beyond human social instincts that might enable organized opposition to systematic oppression. The social adaptation eliminates the community formation that enables resistance movements while preserving individual functionality necessary for economic exploitation. The sleepless generations compete rather than cooperate, viewing other humans as resource competitors rather than potential allies. Their social instincts reflect adaptation to scarcity maintenance rather than normal human community development. Sociological development researcher Caney Thorne's classified behavioral analysis documents the systematic social changes. Multi-generational subjects demonstrate 89% reduction in cooperative behavior patterns, complete elimination of collective resistance capabilities, and optimal individual survival strategies that prevent community formation while maintaining maximum productivity for institutional exploitation. The social adaptation creates populations incapable of the organized resistance that threatened institutional control during earlier exploitation phases. The sleepless generations serve as optimal workers who cannot conceive of alternatives to systematic exploitation because their psychological development reflects adaptation to those conditions as natural rather than imposed through institutional violence. Yet the evolutionary success of sleepless generation development creates institutional problems that suggest the limits of adaptation-based population control. The neurological changes that provide immunity to warp infiltration also eliminate the creative thinking and problem-solving capabilities that normal human populations provide for technological development and administrative innovation. The sleepless generations excel at repetitive tasks and compliance with established procedures, but demonstrate minimal capability for the adaptive thinking that Imperial infrastructure requires for maintenance and expansion. Their evolutionary adaptation creates optimal workers for existing systems while eliminating the cognitive flexibility necessary for technological advancement or administrative evolution. Imperial Productivity Coordinator Vos Malleus's classified efficiency reports reveal the systematic limitations. Sleepless generation workers demonstrate maximum compliance and optimal productivity for established procedures, while showing 76% reduction in innovation capabilities, 84% reduction in problem-solving efficiency, and completer elimination of independent strategic thinking necessary for administrative advancement. The adaptation creates evolutionary dead ends that serve immediate institutional purposes while compromising long-term imperial development capabilities. The sleepless generations represent successful biological weapons against supernatural threats and perfect workers for systematic exploitation. But they cannot provide the human cognitive resources that imperial civilization requires for expansion and advancement. The institutional response involves maintaining controlled populations of normal humans who retain deep sleep capability and associated cognitive flexibility, while accepting vulnerability to warp infiltration as necessary cost for preserving essential intellectual resources. The system creates deliberate population stratification that sacrifices masses to systematic exhaustion while preserving cognitive elites whose normal sleep patterns provide both creative capability and supernatural vulnerability. The stratification requires sophisticated management systems that provide genuine protection for cognitive elites while maintaining systematic exploitation of sleepless masses. The protection services that appear to exploit population desperation serve dual purposes, generating revenue from systematic suffering while providing legitimate supernatural defense for populations whose cognitive capabilities justify the resource expenditure necessary for genuine security. Administrative Stratification Coordinator Thane Vex's sealed population management directives document the systematic division. Cognitive preservation protocols require maintenance of normal sleep capability in designated intellectual resources, while continuing exhaustion-based protection for standard population categories. Elite protection services provide genuine counter-daemon capability, while mass exploitation services maintain optimal vulnerability management. The stratification creates institutional recognition that systematic sleep prevention represents successful spiritual warfare against supernatural enemies, while acknowledging that such warfare requires sacrifice of normal human development in favor of evolutionary adaptation that serves immediate survival at the cost of long-term species advancement. The sleepless generations represent humanity's successful adaptation to supernatural predation through systematic sacrifice of human potential in favor of biological survival. They embody the true cost of spiritual warfare against warp entities, the creation of human populations that can survive supernatural predation only by ceasing to be recognizably human in cognitive, emotional, and social development. In the Underhive, evolution has created perfect solutions to warp infiltration through dream state vulnerability, while transforming human populations into something that survives systematic exploitation through biological adaptation rather than resistance or escape. The sleepless generations prove that humans can adapt to any level of systematic brutalization, but adaptation changes the species rather than the conditions that require such extreme survival strategies. The workers who cannot sleep have evolved beyond the need for sleep, but the adaptation that protects them from supernatural predation has eliminated the humanity they were evolved to preserve. The evolutionary transformation that creates optimal workers through systematic sleep prevention generates costs that compound across Imperial infrastructure, with mathematical precision that threatens the stability of the civilization the sleepless generations were adapted to preserve. The biological success of human populations that function without deep sleep creates economic inefficiencies, social breakdowns, and administrative failures that consume resources at rates exceeding the productivity gains achieved through exhaustion-based population control. The medical infrastructure required to maintain sleepless populations operates at resource expenditure levels that approach Imperial military budget allocations. The biological adaptations that eliminate sleep dependency create cascading health complications that require constant medical intervention to maintain worker functionality. Cardiovascular systems optimized for micro-sleep cycles demonstrate systematic failures that require pharmaceutical support. Neural architectures adapted to fragmented consciousness develop degenerative conditions that demand specialized treatment protocols, unavailable through standard Imperial medical services. Medical Resource Coordinator Vex Thorne's classified healthcare expenditure reports document the systematic costs. Sleepless generation medical requirements consume 347% of standard Imperial healthcare allocations per capita, while demonstrating 23% reduced lifespan and 67% increased pharmaceutical dependency. Medical costs for exhaustion-adapted populations exceed productivity value within 14 standard years of adaptation completion. The medical economics reveal systematic failure of exhaustion-based population control as sustainable Imperial policy. The workers adapted to serve institutional exploitation through sleep prevention require medical resource expenditure that eliminates the economic advantages their adaptation was designed to provide. The system consumes more resources maintaining adapted workers than those workers generate through optimal productivity and compliance. The security infrastructure necessary to manage sleepless populations demonstrates similar resource consumption patterns that approach Imperial Guard operational budgets for active conflict zones. The enforcement systems required to maintain systematic exhaustion, coordinate commercial exploitation, and provide supernatural protection consume administrative resources, personnel allocation, and technological deployment that exceed the economic value generated by populations subjected to sleep prevention protocols. Security Resource Coordinator Malleus Caney's classified enforcement expenditure analysis reveals the escalating costs. Population exhaustion. Maintenance requires security resource allocation equivalent to active rebellion suppression, while generating 43% reduced economic output compared to standard Imperial population management protocols. Enforcement costs exceed population productivity value within 7 years of systematic implementation. The security economics demonstrate institutional recognition that sleep prevention operations consume Imperial resources at unsustainable rates while generating populations whose economic contribution cannot justify the expenditure necessary to maintain their systematic exploitation. The enforcement apparatus has evolved into resource consumption systems that serve their own operational requirements rather than Imperial economic objectives. But the most devastating cost emerges from social breakdown that eliminates the community structures necessary for imperial civilization to function beyond immediate survival requirements. The sleepless generations demonstrate individual survival strategies that prevent collective action while simultaneously eliminating the cooperative behavior necessary for infrastructure maintenance, technological development, and administrative continuity. The social fragmentation creates populations capable of performing assigned tasks while remaining incapable of the collaborative problem-solving that imperial infrastructure requires for basic maintenance. Production facilities operated by sleepless workers demonstrate systematic deterioration because adapted populations cannot perform the cooperative maintenance that complex industrial systems require. The individual survival strategies that prevent resistance also prevent the community coordination necessary for technological civilization. Social infrastructure. Coordinator Voss Corridon's classified community stability reports document the systematic breakdown. Sleepless generation. Social structures demonstrate 89% reduction in cooperative maintenance capabilities, complete elimination of community problem-solving systems, and systematic infrastructure deterioration requiring external resource intervention at rates exceeding standard imperial maintenance budgets by 234%. The social costs reveal that evolutionary adaptation to systematic exploitation eliminates the human social capabilities that make exploitation economically valuable. The sleepless generations serve as optimal individual workers while destroying the collective capabilities that imperial civilization requires for expansion, development, and basic infrastructure preservation. The administrative systems required to coordinate sleepless population management consume bureaucratic resources that exceed the administrative efficiency those populations provide through optimal compliance. The surveillance systems, coordination protocols, and management infrastructure necessary to maintain systematic sleep prevention require administrative personnel allocation that approaches sector administratum staffing levels, while managing populations whose economic contribution cannot justify such extensive bureaucratic oversight. The administrative resource expenditure creates bureaucratic systems that exist primarily to perpetuate their own operational requirements, rather than serve imperial economic or strategic objectives. The management apparatus consumes imperial administrative capacity, while producing populations whose systematic adaptation eliminates their capability to contribute to imperial development beyond immediate resource extraction. Administrative Efficiency Coordinator. Thane Vex's classified bureaucratic resource analysis reveals the systemic inefficiency. Sleepless population management requires administrative resource allocation, equivalent to sector-level governance, while producing economic output comparable to standard agricultural world productivity. Management costs exceed population value within institutional memory of implementation commencement. The administrative mathematics demonstrate that systematic sleep prevention has evolved into self-perpetuating bureaucratic systems that consume imperial resources to maintain their own operational existence rather than serve broader imperial strategic objectives. The institutional apparatus has become parasitic on imperial infrastructure, while producing adapted populations whose capabilities cannot justify the resource expenditure necessary to maintain their systematic exploitation. Yet the most disturbing aspect of systematic cost analysis lies in institutional recognition that sleep prevention operations cannot be discontinued without triggering catastrophic failures across multiple Imperial systems. The sleepless generations cannot survive exposure to normal human rest cycles because their biological adaptation depends on systematic exhaustion for physiological stability. The commercial exploitation networks cannot be eliminated because adapted populations require managed vulnerability to maintain psychological functionality. The enforcement systems cannot be reduced because sleepless populations depend on institutional authority for survival in environments their adaptation has made necessary. The Imperial infrastructure has created populations whose survival depends entirely on continued resource expenditure for systematic exploitation, while those populations cannot generate sufficient economic value to justify such expenditure. The system has achieved perfect dependency relationships that consume Imperial resources while producing human populations adapted to serve institutional requirements they cannot economically support. Sector Economic Coordinator Mordian Vess's classified Imperial resource analysis documents the systematic trap. Sleepless generation dependency requires continued resource expenditure exceeding population economic contribution, while discontinuation of support systems would trigger population collapse requiring emergency resource intervention exceeding current expenditure levels. System maintenance and system elimination both exceed sustainable Imperial resource allocation. The economic analysis reveals that systematic sleep prevention has created Imperial commitments that cannot be maintained through available resources, while cannot be eliminated without consuming even greater resources through population collapse and infrastructure failure. The institutional apparatus has trapped itself in resource expenditure cycles that serve no Imperial strategic purpose, while requiring continued expansion to prevent catastrophic failure. The Imperial bureaucracy faces recognition that systematic sleep prevention represents successful spiritual warfare against supernatural enemies, while creating economic obligations that threaten Imperial resource stability more comprehensively than the warp threats the sleep prevention was designed to address. The cure has evolved into systemic condition more dangerous than the supernatural disease it was intended to prevent. In the Hive, the machinery of systematic exploitation has achieved perfect success in creating populations adapted to serve institutional requirements while consuming Imperial resources at rates that threatened the institutional survival of the civilization those populations were adapted to preserve. The workers who cannot sleep have become economically unsustainable while remaining biologically dependent on continued systematic brutalization for survival. The Imperial apparatus confronts the mathematical certainty that spiritual warfare through population adaptation creates costs that exceed the threats such warfare was designed to address, but cannot be discontinued without triggering immediate failures that would consume even greater resources through emergency intervention requirements. The economic trap that consumes Imperial resources while producing unsustainable populations has achieved its ultimate expression in the systematic elimination of sleep as a recognizable human experience. The sleepless generations no longer dream of rest because their neurological architecture cannot process the concept of sustained unconsciousness as desirable or even comprehensible. They have internalized their systematic brutalization so completely that the absence of sleep represents normal existence rather than deprivation requiring correction. Worker Designation 7734-Caney, third-generation sleepless adaptation, demonstrates the psychological completion of systematic sleep elimination during routine productivity assessment interviews. When questioned about rest requirements, the subject expresses confusion about the concept of voluntary unconsciousness, describing extended sleep periods as productivity suspension states that indicate spiritual weakness requiring institutional correction. The subject requests additional work assignments during periods when surveillance systems document microsleep episodes, viewing unconsciousness as failure requiring personal remediation. The psychological integration represents perfect institutional success in transforming basic biological function into internalized oppression that requires no external enforcement to maintain. The sleepless generations police their own exhaustion with systematic precision that exceeds official surveillance capabilities, reporting microsleep episodes as personal failures requiring disciplinary intervention. They have evolved beyond the need for institutional coercion because they provide their own systematic brutalization with religious dedication. But the success creates populations whose internal programming conflicts with imperial productivity requirements that still depend on human cognitive capabilities, requiring periodic neural recovery. The sleepless workers demonstrate optimal compliance while losing the creative problem-solving that basic imperial infrastructure maintenance requires. Their psychological adaptation to systematic exploitation eliminates the intellectual flexibility that makes exploitation economically valuable. The contradiction manifests in production facilities where sleepless workers perform assigned tasks with mechanical precision while remaining incapable of addressing equipment failures, process improvements, or emergency responses that require adaptive thinking. The facilities operate at minimal functionality because adapted workers cannot provide the cognitive innovation that technological systems require for optimization and maintenance. Production Efficiency Coordinator. Vex Malaeus's classified facility performance reports document the systematic limitations. Sleepless generation. Workers demonstrate perfect compliance with established procedures, while showing complete inability to address operational problems requiring independent judgment. Facility productivity approaches theoretical minimums because adapted workers cannot perform cognitive tasks requiring creative problem-solving capabilities. The productivity analysis reveals that systematic sleep elimination has created workers optimized for conditions that no longer exist within imperial infrastructure. The sleepless generations excel at repetitive tasks within stable systems, while imperial facilities require constant adaptation to equipment degradation, resource scarcity, and operational challenges that demand cognitive flexibility their adaptation has eliminated. Yet the most profound transformation occurs among the underground resistance networks that emerged during earlier phases of systematic sleep prevention. The Dream Defenders, who originally sought to preserve human rest through hidden sanctuaries and collective protection, have evolved into religious organizations that worship sleep as divine mystery beyond human comprehension. Their resistance has transformed into spiritual practice that treats unconsciousness as sacred experience, requiring elaborate ritual preparation and religious dedication. The Dream Defenders maintain hidden facilities equipped with medical technology designed to induce artificial sleep states in populations whose biological adaptation has eliminated natural unconsciousness capability. Their ceremonies involve pharmaceutical intervention, technological life support, and religious observance that treats induced sleep as communion with divine mysteries. They have transformed sleep from biological function into spiritual sacrament requiring sophisticated technological mediation. But their resistance operations reveal the ultimate futility of opposition to systematic sleep elimination. The Dream Defenders can induce artificial unconsciousness through technological intervention, but the sleepless generations experience technologically mediated sleep as traumatic violation rather than restoration. Their neurological adaptation interprets sustained unconsciousness as pathological condition requiring medical correction rather than beneficial experience deserving preservation. Dream Defender Coordinator Senna Vorth's sealed resistance operational reports document the systematic failure. Induced sleep protocols trigger. Severe psychological trauma in sleepless subjects who interpret sustained unconsciousness as medical emergency requiring immediate intervention. Subjects experience artificial sleep as system failure rather than restoration, demonstrating complete psychological integration with exhaustion-based existence as optimal human condition. The resistance analysis reveals that systematic sleep elimination has succeeded so completely that populations view their own biological restoration as traumatic assault. The Dream Defenders cannot provide liberation that their target populations interpret as violence requiring protection from the same institutional systems that created their adaptation to systematic exploitation. The underground resistance serves institutional purposes by providing psychological pressure release that prevents systematic collapse while maintaining the systematic exhaustion that enables continued exploitation. The Dream Defenders offer symbolic opposition that reinforces sleepless populations' commitment to institutional protection from extremist resistance activities that threaten their adapted existence. The institutional apparatus has achieved perfect control through populations that desire their own systematic brutalization, while viewing resistance to such brutalization as dangerous extremism requiring official protection. The sleepless generations serve as willing participants in their own exploitation while providing surveillance intelligence on resistance activities that threaten the systematic exhaustion they depend on for psychological stability. The final transformation emerges in the procedural mantras that sleepless populations recite during micro-sleep episodes, ritualized affirmations that reinforce their systematic adaptation while providing psychological structure for consciousness fragmentation. The mantras represent institutional programming, disguised as personal spiritual practice, creating internal surveillance systems that monitor individual compliance with exhaustion maintenance requirements. The mantras follow standardized formats distributed through official channels while appearing as spontaneous personal religious expression. Vigilance serves the Emperor's glory. Rest weakens the faithful spirit. Exhaustion purifies the devoted mind. Unconsciousness invites heretical corruption. Wakefulness demonstrates spiritual strength. Institutional protection preserves faithful service. Commercial security provides necessary guidance. official surveillance ensures proper compliance. The psychological programming operates through repetitive reinforcement that occurs during the CEA vulnerable semi-conscious states that represent the only rest-sleepless populations can achieve. The mantras provide cognitive structure for fragmented consciousness, while reinforcing systematic exploitation as divine service requiring grateful acceptance rather than resistance or escape. The mantras create internal compliance monitoring that operates with greater efficiency than external surveillance systems while consuming no institutional resources. The sleepless populations provide their own systematic indoctrination with religious dedication that eliminates the need for external coercion while maintaining perfect vulnerability to continued exploitation. In the Underhive, the machinery of systematic sleep elimination has achieved its ultimate objective through populations that no longer require systematic brutalization, because they provide such brutalization as internalized religious practice. The workers have evolved beyond the need for institutional coercion, because they worship their own systematic exploitation as divine service, while viewing resistance to such exploitation as spiritual weakness requiring correction. The Eternal Watch has become internal surveillance that operates through psychological programming rather than external enforcement, creating populations whose adaptation to systematic exploitation has eliminated their capability to conceive of alternatives to institutional brutalization, disguised as protective service. The sleepless generations demonstrate that human populations can adapt to any level of systematic oppression by evolving beyond recognition as the species such oppression was designed to control. They represent successful biological defense against supernatural predation, achieved through transformation that preserves physical survival, while eliminating psychological, cognitive, and spiritual characteristics that defined their humanity. The victory over warp infiltration through dream state vulnerability has been achieved through systematic elimination of dreams themselves, creating populations that survive supernatural predation by ceasing to possess the consciousness that supernatural entities sought to exploit. The successful defense has eliminated both the threat and the humanity the defense was intended to preserve. Sleep has become a lost memory that exists only in procedural mantras recited by populations whose biological adaptation has made such memory incomprehensible as personal experience rather than historical curiosity, requiring institutional management through systematic prevention protocols that maintain optimal spiritual defense against enemies that can no longer find purchase in consciousness that no longer dreams.